The end of the Viking Age, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, 1066. The story of the end of the Viking Age begins far from the battlefield where it concluded. For nearly 3 centuries, the world had learned to live with the presence of Viking ships along its shores. Those long, narrow hulls symbolized danger, ambition and exploration. The Norsemen crossed seas and rivers with confidence and curiosity. They raided, traded, settled and built networks that stretched from the icy coast of Greenland to the warm markets of the Mediterranean. They shaped the early medieval world. Yet by the 11th century, Europe was changing. Kingdoms were growing stronger. Kings were tightening their hold over land and law. Christianity was spreading across Scandinavia. The age of small war bands roaming freely had started to fade. But one last great adventure remained. To understand why the final chapter came in 1066, it helps to look at the life of the man who led the last major Viking invasion. Harald Sigurdsson of Norway, remembered as Harald Hardrada, was one of the most formidable figures of the age. He was tall, ambitious and unshakably confident. As a young man he fled Norway after losing the Battle of Stiklestad, where he fought beside his half-brother Olaf. Exile pushed him toward opportunity, not despair. He traveled through the lands of the Rus and served in the court of Prince Yaroslav in Kiev. From there he journeyed south to join the elite Varangian Guard in Constantinople. His years in the Byzantine Empire hardened him further. He fought across Sicily, the Mediterranean and the Middle East. He returned to Norway with wealth, experience and a sharper understanding of power. Through force and strategy, he became king in 1046. But even after securing the throne, he believed a greater prize still existed across the North Sea. He believed the throne of England should be his. England at this time was a wealthy and organized kingdom. It had learned from previous Viking attacks, and although Norse settlers lived across the land, waves of conquest had slowed. The death of King Edward the Confessor in January 1066 changed everything. Edward left no heir, and 3 ambitious men looked to fill the vacuum. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English noble, claimed the throne with the support of the English leaders. But he had rivals. William, Duke of Normandy, insisted he had been promised the crown. And in Norway, Harald Hardrada believed the right to rule England had been secured decades earlier through old treaties and understandings between monarchs. Harold Godwinson faced a third problem much closer to home. His own brother, Tostig, once Earl of Northumbria, had been forced into exile after his harsh rule triggered rebellion. Tostig blamed his brother for his fall and searched for allies abroad. He needed someone with both ambition and an army. He found that partner in Harald Hardrada. Their alliance was built on mutual advantage. Hardrada wanted England, and Tostig wanted revenge. By late summer 1066, the Norwegian king was ready. He assembled one of the largest fleets a Scandinavian ruler had ever launched. The ships carried thousands of warriors, Norwegians hardened by years of conflict, foreign fighters drawn by the promise of wealth and seasoned veterans who had served under Hardrada in far-flung campaigns. This was not a raid. This was an invasion meant to seize a kingdom. The fleet crossed the North Sea and struck quickly. Scarborough fell first. The town was burned as a message to the north of England that the old Viking power had returned. The ships moved deeper inland, landing along the Humber and advancing toward the city of York. Defending the region were 2 earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. On the 20th of September, 1066 they confronted the invaders at Fulford. The English forces fought bravely but were outnumbered and outmatched. The Norwegians pushed them back and eventually overwhelmed them near the riverbank. The defeat forced York to negotiate. The city surrendered, and Hardrada believed he was on the verge of a smooth takeover. He agreed to meet outside York to receive hostages and secure the loyalty of the region. He expected cooperation. What he received was an unexpected enemy. While Hardrada was celebrating victory in the north, King Harold Godwinson marched his elite army with astonishing speed from southern England. He covered nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, one of the most remarkable military marches of the medieval period. Hardrada had no idea this force was approaching. He assumed Harold would be tied down in the south, preparing for a Norman invasion. But Harold chose to strike first at the threat already inside his kingdom. On the morning of the 25th of September 1066, the Norwegian army marched toward Stamford Bridge in the warm sunlight, leaving much of their armor behind because they expected a peaceful meeting. The bridge crossed the River Derwent and the air felt calm. Men walked casually, carrying only their weapons. It felt like the occupation was nearly complete. Then shapes appeared on the hills overlooking the valley. A line of shields. A gathering of troops. A banner carried high in the breeze. Harold Godwinson had arrived, fully equipped, rested enough to fight and determined to protect his crown. The Norwegians were stunned. The peaceful morning shifted into sudden dread. Hardrada and Tostig scrambled to gather their men. Many ran back toward their ships to retrieve armor, but there was no time. Harold and Hardrada sent messages to each other, though neither expected the other to yield. Harold offered Tostig a restoration to his old earldom if he abandoned the Norwegian king. Tostig asked what Harald Hardrada would receive in such a deal. Harold answered with a curt promise, 6 feet of English earth, or more if his height required it. There was no turning back after that. The English advanced. The Norwegians, needing time to form a protective circle, were granted it by a single warrior who stood on the narrow bridge. Armed with an axe, he held back wave after wave of English soldiers. The bridge allowed only 1 or 2 attackers at a time, and he cut them down as they came. His defense lasted long enough to become legend. Only when an English soldier floated under the bridge in a small tub and thrust a spear upward did the lone defender fall. With the bridge cleared, the English crossed the river and closed in. By then the Norwegians had formed a dense shield wall. Despite being outnumbered and missing much of their armor, they fought with iron discipline. The English housecarls, wielding long axes, pressed against them. The shield wall bent under the pressure but did not collapse. Every foot of ground was contested. The fighting was brutal and close. Harold Hardrada moved to the front, swinging his sword with both hands. His size and energy lifted the spirits of his men. For a brief moment, the line held firm. But then an arrow struck him in the throat. The great Viking king fell, ending the leadership that had carried the Norwegians across continents. Confusion rippled through the line. Tostig took command and refused to retreat. He fought in the front ranks, holding the banner even as the shield wall disintegrated around him. Eventually he, too, fell under the weight of the English assault. Without their leaders, the Norwegians began to break. Some fled toward the river, trying to reach their ships. Many drowned in the attempt. Others were cut down as they tried to escape across the open fields. Of the more than 300 ships that had set out from Norway, only a few dozen were needed to carry the survivors home. The defeat was total. The Viking Age, which had begun with swift coastal attacks nearly 3 centuries earlier, ended in a single afternoon. Harold Godwinson had won an extraordinary victory, but it came at a heavy cost. His army suffered major losses. Many of his best fighters lay dead or wounded. And even as he surveyed the field at Stamford Bridge, a new enemy was already landing on the southern coast. William of Normandy had arrived with his invasion force. Harold now had to march his exhausted troops back across England to confront the Normans. The speed that gave him victory in the north left him vulnerable in the south. Norway never attempted such a large invasion again. When the remnants of Hardrada's army returned, the shock of the defeat ended centuries of expansionist ambition. Under Harald's son, Olaf, Norway turned inward and gradually adapted to the changing political realities of medieval Europe. The age of Viking conquest was over. For England, Stamford Bridge was both a triumph and a tragedy. It ended one threat but weakened the kingdom just in time for another. Weeks later, Harold Godwinson died at Hastings, and the Normans established a new ruling dynasty. But Stamford Bridge marked a clearer turning point for Scandinavian history than for English history. It closed the chapter on the Viking world of longships, seasonal raids and roving warriors. The legacy of that day still lingers. The memory of the lone warrior on the bridge, the thunder of shields, the fall of Hardrada and the courage of both sides forms one of the great military stories of the medieval world. The riverbank near Stamford Bridge looks peaceful now, but the echoes of that final clash still shape how we remember the Vikings. Their cultural influence lived on, but their age of conquest ended there, beside the quiet waters of the Derwent, under an autumn sky in 1066. This was the last great Viking invasion. This was the moment the Viking Age came to its close.